This story has been recorded at an Addictive Eaters Anonymous meeting in New Zealand. You can email us at contact@aeanz.org.
My name is Robyn and I am an addictive eater. Now, I haven't really had much of a chance to think about sitting up here until now. Now I feel quite nervous. I don't know why. It's great to be here. It's good to know what I am, because never knew what was wrong with me. Always felt very different in my family, but never knew why. And over the last, the last couple of weeks, just different things have, happened at work or being said at work, and, a memory would flood by, and I just think of, what life was like growing up for me, and, just different things that I did or didn't do as a kid, and most of them were to do with food. And I realised that, I certainly lived in my head. I didn't live, I didn't sort of say a great deal. And in the last 2 days, I have been very much involved in food and, the freedom of not having to eat it. Yesterday, I cook a roast dinner for the residents that I work with once a month, a good old-fashioned roasty, and it was pavlova for dessert. And, just take it that it's all cooked and that it all tastes all right, because, I don't do anything. And then today was a farewell morning tea, and I have to go and choose the cake from Copenhagen's, which, is a ghetto cake. And everybody tells me how beautiful it is, and I have to set it all out, and I do that. I've had a good teacher at that, to make a party table, shall we say. And that's all great. And, and I actually have to cut the cake as well, because nobody else wants to. But, it's done with like rubber gloves, because it's the easiest thing, the knife and the rubber glove, and put it on the plate. But, I haven't once thought about trying it. And that to me is a freedom, because that cake wouldn't have been big enough for me. I would have made my way through it and whatever else was on the table. And, I just never ever thought that would ever happen, because I just didn't know any different. Well, basically, the job that I'm in today, I would never have thought that I would have been there anyway. And so, it's just, like going into the bakery this morning and asking, for a cake. So I was looking for a cake that was actually easy to cut because I had to do it, and I didn't want it with all, lots of stuff on it, because it gets messy. But, it wasn't about what the cake looked like or what the flavour it was. I was thinking of my selfish sort of ways. But anyway, I was told it was a very nice cake, and I'm sure. So, those sort of things is what I do in my day today, not necessarily every day, but most days I am around food, and it's just, I know that, this higher power that I've come to believe since I came in here is working in my life, because, what it was like before was that I would have been eating it. And, and it doesn't. And the other thing that we do on a Friday is we have happy hour. And so that involves actually alcohol. And so, we do that. And that's another thing that, I drank from a very early age. And that too has been removed, because, I haven't had to have a drink today, and I can pour a drink and give it to people and just get involved in what I have to do without having that fear of, picking up the first one. And so it's just all part of the day. But, it wasn't like that before I came in here, because, it was very much into eating and drinking and smoking, and, coffee's become a big thing nowadays, and we have a coffee car come in, I don't know if it's every day or maybe every second day, and, the cups are left out there at reception, And, you can wake up and smell that coffee. And I just think, well, I was drinking a very lot of coffee back in my early days. And because, I just became addicted to it. And, there was coffee and cigarettes and 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning before going to bed. And I used to wonder what was wrong with me when I'd get up, 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock. Well, no, I was never in bed at 7. It was always 6 o'clock. And so, with the eating, with the way my life was, I started to eliminate things. Eliminate, because I thought they were the problems. And so coffee was one of them. And I thought, well, if I didn't drink as much coffee, I would feel better. And so I cut out my lots of cups of coffee that I had, which were black coffee. And I blamed my auntie for that, because when I went to stay with her when I was about 13, I got sick. I got tonsillitis, and she said the best thing to have would be a cup of coffee, black, because, you couldn't have milk because of the, it would stick in the throat. So that's when I started drinking black coffee. So, it was her fault. And that's what I thought. So that's when that started. But, I stopped drinking the coffee. I ended up with a really bad headache for several days and didn't understand that one, but I do today. But, that didn't stop the eating. I was a regular Weight Watcher. I used to go to Weight Watchers a lot, and there was another weed club that, I used to go to. And I would do well for a short time, and then something would happen, and, it would rain on the washing or whatever, and that would be enough to make me say, go and eat. My family, I used to, if there was ever an argument, I would think, I'll show you. But I wouldn't show them, but I'd do it behind closed doors, and I would eat. I was forever cleaning the plates after I cleared the table. If the kids didn't eat what was on the table, I would take them into the kitchen and I would eat what was left on them. And but I'd never tell them. So, all these things to me and everything else I thought were just quite normal. It was very much normal in my day, but, I always wanted to be thin. But I'd never really associated that you can only, really be thin if you don't eat, Robyn. And when you were going to Weight Watchers, you were doing okay. You had the Weight Watchers menu as such. So weighing and measuring my food was just sort of second nature to me. But, it was not what I ate. It was what the hands got out the side. It was like I had shutters on and I would be, grabbing whatever to eat. And I never saw any of this as being, anything really seriously to do with the food. I spent a lot of time thinking about things and a lot of time in my head. And I can see myself when I was at school that I did have friends, but, as I've heard in meetings, and, people said, they had like one friend or two friends. And I used to think, oh, yeah, I sort of got on quite well. And in primary school, I did have, one very close friend that lived close to us. We lived in the country. And then when I went to high school, where there was 4 of us, there was us 4 girls. And we would probably be classed as the naughty girls because, we were always a wee bit daredeviling. And because I had the loudest voice and I swore quite a lot, I got quite a lot of jobs, like the bus monitor, because in the end, I had to travel to high school in the bus. When I went to primary school, we walked to school. But yeah, so I got that job. And I guess you could just about call me a bully, really. I was very, yeah, probably in today's society I would be classed, because I was quite, bullyish. So, yeah, and it's just when I look back at what life was like growing up, there was no communication really in my family. I was the 5th daughter down, so I had 4 older sisters. And so if I wanted to know anything, I just asked them. My mother didn't say a great deal. My father is a drinker, and so never was really a father to us or to me. you know, we didn't have any sort of communication. If I asked him for anything, he'd always say, you know, go and see your mother. So I always, you know, used to do that. So it was a bit of a strange sort of a growing up life, and I blame my mother because, you know, we were brought up in the country and we lived on those roasties that I cooked today, and, you know, and milk puddings, and, you know, it was good, wholesome food, I thought. So nobody ever really thought about, you know, being on a diet, and, you know, home baking and all those things is what we had, you know, when I went to school. And yeah, never really thought too much more about it. And I can't really say when I ever thought I would go on a diet. When I first started dieting, I've never really thought too hard about that. But I do know that it was after I got married, and I got married when I was quite young, and had 2 children, that I was starting to go, you know, to Weight Watchers, and joined Weight Watchers, and it was a Monday night, was the night that I used to go to Weight Watchers. And I used to, in the end, live in fear of getting on those scales, because I knew that I would never lose weight, because I knew what I'd been doing with food. And the more years that had passed of being going to Weight Watchers, and the more weight that, you know, got on, and yeah, over the years of always going back, I just knew that I had to lose, you know, 100 grams on that Monday night. And it was sheer hell sometimes, because, you know, I'd lose the 100 grams, get a hamburger on the way home, because, you know, that was a celebration, because, you know, let's go and get something to eat. And then I would say I'd start on Tuesday, and Tuesday would never come, because, you know, oh well, you know, I'll start tomorrow. And so sometimes it would get to Friday, and I think I've got to do something, because I've got to go to Weight Watchers on Monday night, and I'm going to get on those scales, and you know, it's going to show that I put on weight. So in the end, over the years, but in the last time that I went to Weight Watchers, I was basically trying to starve myself on a Saturday and a Sunday, so that, you know, I could get on those scales on a Monday and look like I had worked hard, you know, or had come to a plateau, they would say. So that's what would happen. That was the sort of wee treadmill cycle that I was on. And, you know, it just, yeah, my ex-husband, he came with me to Weight Watchers, and he lost a lot of weight. And I could never work out why he was doing it. But then I said, oh, that was because I was preparing the meal for him, and I would make sure that, you know, he was eating what he was meant to eat. But, you know, I didn't look at what I was eating. And, yeah. So that was the wee cycle of, you know, just my eating, and it was just, you know, insane. And I hear about it, and, you know, I read about it, and I just think of some of the insane things of, like, keeping chocolate buttons in the freezer because you're going to make Easter eggs with them. And then all of a sudden the light switch goes on that you've got those chocolate buttons in the freezer. So instead of going and getting the bag of chocolate buttons and sitting and eating them, you just get up one at a time or 2 at a time, and you just keep going backwards and forwards until the packet's actually finished. And then you think, well, why did you do that? You know, and those were the sort of things that I see today as insanity, but to me they were quite normal. So that life went on for quite some time, and I finally, I smoked from a very early age as well. I did everything from quite an early age. So, you know, I used to roll my own cigarettes when I was about 10, my sister and I did, and, you know, I loved the effects of cigarettes. I loved having a cigarette. And so I smoked even when I was going to high school. I used to come home from school and I'd have a cigarette. My mother actually bought me cigarettes once. I don't know why she did that, but she did. And so, you know, I would sit and do my homework and be fagging. And, yeah. But eventually, after a number of years of doing that, and I did get up to about 25 cigarettes in the day, and all my cups of coffee, and that's what made me feel like I had a really bad hangover. in the mornings. One night, this dear ex-husband of mine went down to get me cigarettes. We lived about 5 miles out of Edendale, and I went to work because I had a job cleaning a nursery. It wasn't a baby nursery, it was a tree nursery, and I used to go to work about 2:45. Kylie, the youngest son, came with me. He would be probably about 9 or 10 at the time. And I went along to clean it, and I had 2 cigarettes left. And he was to go down there to get my cigarettes and pick me up from work, or pick us up from work, about 6. Well, he didn't come, and he didn't come. So in the end, we were about a mile from where we lived, from just along the road, really. So we started walking. I had a cigarette on the way home, and when I got home, he was there, silly as a chook. And my sister was staying with us at the time, and she had 3 children. And he had gone into Edendale to get my cigarettes, but he went to the pub instead. And so by the time he got home, he, had had his fair share, and he forgot them. And that wasn't a good thing to do. And but anyway, I had my last cigarette that night after tea, and I don't know how long ago that was. It must be getting 35 years plus. And but they paid the price, because whatever came out of my mouth was not good for a couple of weeks. But I used to go to bed, and I used to say, I haven't had a cigarette today, and I really don't want to have one tomorrow, because I really didn't want to, because I wasn't enjoying them. I just didn't enjoy that first one in the morning anymore, and of course I kept having more to get that enjoyment. So I did stop smoking. I did lots of things to keep my hands busy, knitted a jersey, cleared the table, I think, before they were even finished. The meal sometimes, just get those dishes done and get out and do this and do that. And so that was the end of, my cigarettes, and never had one near my lips since, because I knew, what would happen. And yeah, but that going to bed at night saying that, to me today, I would say that's the wee prayer that I used to do when I first came in here. But I would not have had you tell me that, because that would have been saying I was praying, and I wouldn't pray. I wouldn't do anything like that. So to me, then the food took off, as much as I didn't want it to, as much as I knew people would say, once you stop smoking, you're going to eat more, and I was determined I wasn't going to do that. But anyway, somewhere along the line it slipped in, because I remember hopping on the scales once, and I used to be on and off the scales, on and off, on and off. And what I didn't like was at night time, because I always weighed heavier at night time, so I'd weigh myself in the morning. But after I'd stopped smoking for some time, I hopped on those scales, and they said that I was 14 stone. So those scales got put somewhere. I don't know where they went, but I never got them back out again, because I thought, you're not going to tell me that, because I didn't want to know that. So that I knew then that, my eating had taken off. And I had tried all the diets that I could try up until then. Life was really unmanageable, like it says in step 1. And 2 boys were growing up, and I didn't know how. I didn't know how to, handle them when they were growing up. I had a husband that was drinking, and, we partied and I drank, but, the eating was really taking off, and it was so secret. I wasn't letting a lot of, people see. They could see by the size that I was getting bigger. I was in and out like a yo-yo, but, definitely getting, bigger, and I didn't know what to do about it. I was eating things that I didn't like, but I had to have them. Couldn't understand it. Moro bars was something that I really didn't like. I found them too sickly. But I remember eating 3 of them once when I was going to this wee job, and I actually felt quite sick, and I had to be sent home, and they couldn't work out what's wrong with me. I knew what was wrong with me, but I never said anything. So, you know, all these things were still going on in my mind. And eventually things had got really, really bad within our household. And Alan had a very kind brother, and he thought that maybe, you know, if Alan got a job up here in Christchurch, that, you know, we could save some money and buy a house down there. And I knew that wasn't true, because I couldn't see that ever happening. But anyway, Alan moved up here to Christchurch, and he moved to Christchurch and he worked up here for about a year. I lived down south with the boys, and they were in high school, and I had a job doing different things. I had a couple of jobs, and eventually got a call from Alan's boss to say that things weren't good with him, that he was drinking a lot, you know, and he missed us and blah, blah, blah. And would we ever consider moving to Christchurch? And I said no. I said, there's no way. You know, I was born and bred down there, and I tried living here in the city. When Mark was born here in Christchurch, when we first got married, Mark was born here, and I couldn't handle it, so we moved back down south. And I just said no. And that was sort of like the end of the story, I thought. But anyway, we chatted some more, and by the time I got off the phone, I'd actually said yes. And so I went out and I said to these two boys that were at high school that we were going to be moving to Christchurch. And they were mortified because, you know, I'd always said I didn't like the city and I'd never move. And so, you know, it really blew them away. And so they stood there and they said, but they can't. You know, they've got their friends. And I stood there and went with this finger, and I went up to my chest, if you can't see this because it's a recording. I said, and what about me? What about me? You know, and I stood there yelling this at them and saying, I have lived here all my life and my family's here. And I said, so what about me? And of course they didn't know what to do because I was a very controlling sort of a person. And I realise that now. And I wore the pants in the family. And if I said jump, they jumped. And yeah. So anyway, eventually, I don't know how long it took after that wee episode, but we moved to Christchurch. We moved in March. We moved in Easter. And we had this big dog that I turned into an addictive eater as well. And he ruled the roost and didn't want a dog, but we took the dog off my brother, so we saved his life. And we had this dog. So there was two teenage boys in the back of the car and a big dog. He was a Rhodesian Ridgeback Cross Labrador. And so he sat in the middle of this car, and we drove to Christchurch, and we moved to Christchurch, and life became worse. It didn't get any better, and it did get worse. It rained, I think, for several weeks when we first come, which meant the dog had to be inside, and he liked the fire. And the kids used to argue about this dog sitting, taking all the heat from the fire and being right in front of the fire. So I see this as my last act of insanity, I thought. I decided that the dog would get put down. So we were all sitting at the table this night at tea time. I'd rung the vet, found out how much it was, $45 back then. And so everybody was eating and the dog was inside and he was sort of sitting under the table waiting on any morsel. And that was my fault because, you know, I was always feeding him because I felt guilty eating. So I'd always give him a tidbit, and he, as soon as I would open the cupboard where the biscuits were or whatever, he'd be there and he'd be, you know, waiting on something. So, you know, I saw it as my fault. But anyway, we were sitting at the table and they were cursing the dog. And I said, well, that's all right. He's going to get put down tomorrow. Well, everybody stopped and dropped their knives and forks basically. And they said, what? And I said, well, the dog's a problem. I said, so, you know, and this was my way. You know, if you had a problem, just get rid of it. So I said, just get rid of it. I said, no, we're going to put it down. I said, and that's a problem solved. And everybody, they just sort of sat there and looked at me. And, of course, I just burst out crying because, you know, I thought, well, what else can I do? I didn't know what to do. And I see that today as just, you know, just part of the insanity. And I thought, well, just get rid of it. You'd get rid of that problem then that'll go away and everything will be fine. Because, we moved to Christchurch and it was going to be fine, but it wasn't fine, and I didn't know what to do. So anyway, everybody loved the dog after that. No complaints about the dog, and the dog did live a number of years later until naturally he had to go to heaven. So, but things got worse at home, and I got a job. I did get a job about May. We moved in March, so I got a job. I got a job in March, April, May. And I read the ad in the paper about, is food causing you a problem? And I went to this job. I was a clothing examiner, and I worked with a lot of women older than me. And I went and asked them if they knew anything about this program that I'd read, a 12-step program. And they said, I think you'll find it's religious. Well, that was enough for me. That wiped it, because I thought nobody's going to preach beep God to me. So that wiped it. And because, I was a non-believer in God, and I really had strong views on that, and I don't know why. It wasn't the way I was brought up, but I did have very strong views. And yet, if I was in a church, I always felt very peaceful. And my sister and I used to sneak into the Matera Island church, just to have a wee bit of a nose every now and then. And so, when that was mentioned, I still had that anti-feeling about God. So that was okay. That was fine. Wiped that one. Continued eating. The eating was definitely getting worse. Life was becoming, like it says in step 1, totally unmanageable. It was sheer hell, really. Arguments at home. I heard in a meeting one day about somebody sharing about their children, and I sat there and I thought, I brought up 2 kids, and I don't know how through all the madness that we had in our life, there was these 2 kids. And so anyway, lost my train of thought. Anyway, yes, as I said, life got worse, and then once again, reading the paper, I read this ad, and it was like a neon light. I tried my last diet, which was the Herbalife diet with my sister-in-law. That was the last ditch effort that I tried, and I couldn't. I had the drink in the morning and the drink at lunchtime, and then you were to eat solid for tea, and I couldn't do it. I got to 11 o'clock, and I remember I rang her and I said, I can't do this. I can't have that drink, and I can't. So to me, that was it. There was going to be no more dieting. So that just, dieting went out the door. So this day, reading the paper again, I thought I'll do something about it. And so back then you wrote away to a P.O. box number, and I did that. And I had someone share her story. She rang me, and she shared, a story, and she told me she was going away for 2 weeks holiday, and she gave me the phone number of someone, and I said, it will be fine. I'll be fine within that 2 weeks. Well, I wasn't. For some reason, I picked up the phone and eventually got hold of this other person, and that was a bit of a mammoth go, but I did. And we arranged that, she could come round and share her story with me, and I didn't know what to expect. And so that's what she did. Spent all, that was on a Sunday morning, and I spent, all weekend tidying, cleaning, because I was one of those, obsessive cleaner. I spent a lot of hours cleaning. I could go to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning after cleaning the lounge and doing everything, and I could get up again at 6 and do it all over again, because that's what I was like. So anyway, did that, and she shared her story. I can't remember too much, except she talked about, her eating. And I think I did ask something about maybe God, and I think she may have said it was a spiritual program. And as she was leaving, after she left, we arranged that she would come and pick me up and, take me to a meeting. As she was leaving, she said, I haven't had to eat today. And I thought, shite. I didn't say that word, but I said, oh, she hasn't had to eat. The love of my life was Elvis Presley and food, and she was not eating. So what do you do? And I thought, they haven't had to, she hasn't had to eat. And she was thin, and I wasn't. And I thought, okay. But, it didn't stop me from going to that first meeting. I didn't think, well, I'm not going to go because, I don't know what I'm going to get, and I'm certainly not going to be able to eat for the rest of my life. But I went to that first meeting, and my first meeting was on a Wednesday night. And, I hear Kay share, and it's, about wearing her clothes, and, she only had sort of like one set of clothes. And I believe, if I'm correct, I had a black skirt and a pink sweatshirt. And they were wooden chairs, and I was a bit worried about sitting on it. And I went to that meeting, and I heard people, Kay was in the chair, and I heard people sharing about what they had done with the food, and they weren't doing it then. And I didn't hear anything else. I didn't see the steps or the serenity prayer or anything on the wall, but I did hear hope. And that's what I got from my first meeting. I heard hope. And I don't know, I can't say I walked out the door and thought, well, yes, this is the answer for me. But there was something in that meeting that made me come back to another one. And that's what happened. I came back to another meeting, and I came back to another meeting. And I just kept coming. I heard that, just don't pick up the first one, get to a meeting and help someone else. And I didn't understand any of that. But what I heard at the meetings was that there was something there that, these people weren't eating like I was. And they talked about their secrets. And my life, to that degree, was a secret as far as the eating goes, because I denied everything when it come to the food, and, spent dollars and dollars on, trying to be thin. So eventually I heard enough to know that I had to. There was a higher power that that these people believed in, and there were steps that they worked, and I came for probably, I don't know how long it was. It could have been 6 weeks. I came to the meetings, and I remember Alan pointing his finger at me one night saying, it's a waste of time you going out, because I was obviously eating again, and I had tried eating the 3 meals a day. I remember that when I first came. And so then one particular night, I'd had enough. On a Thursday night it was, and I thought, I'm going to ring this particular person and ask her for help. I didn't ask for a sponsor because I didn't understand what that was. I heard all these words, but I didn't know what they meant, and I wasn't going to ask because that meant I didn't know, and I was always one that thought I knew everything. So I rang this particular person and asked her if she would help me, and that's what I did. But I still had to make sure the house was clean and the washing was folded, before I did all that. And that's when, I asked for help, and I went, on a food plan, and and that's when it's, started. So I started, I was going to the meetings, and eventually I kept hearing different things. And eventually, I read in the big book one day when I was out walking that, God is doing for us that we could not do for ourselves. Didn't know that was part of the promises, but that was it. And I remember saying out loud, yes, because I went from eating one day to not eating the next. That's how I saw it. And I thought, I don't know how that happened, because I had tried to do that myself. It was suggested that I pray, and, I'd only ever heard the Lord's Prayer, but I heard somebody say that, she used to pray and ask for her higher power or God to be the mental defence against the first one. Well, I didn't have a clue what that meant, but it sounded good. So I said that, and then I said the serenity prayer. And so I believe I eventually, came to believe in a higher power. And that's, what I have today, a higher power that I choose to call God. So from then on, I've been coming to meetings, and I've been doing what's been suggested, and that was the steps. and they certainly didn't make me want to do cartwheels and feel excited. But, you know, I kept hearing in a meeting, if I want to get well, this is what I've got to do. And that's what I've done, you know. And I certainly didn't want to tell anybody my nitty-gritties, but, you know, I heard that too, and if I want to get well. And so, you know, I've come to believe in a higher power, and I choose to call that higher power God. And I haven't had to eat today. I heard that, you know, all I've got to do is for 24 hours. And, you know, you don't have to have an ice cream today, Robyn. And, you know, acceptance is the answer to all my problems. So all these things, you know, but it's taken me a long time to get them all in there. And I hear Leonie share about having 2 lives, and I totally agree with that. I feel like I've had 3, because I've had the life of addiction, and then I've had the life of coming in, and then I've had a life on my own without a husband. And, you know, and I've got a job today that I never thought I would ever have. And it's coming up 29 years since I've started that job. And, you know, and I love my job. I like working with the people, the residents that I have. And I just, yeah, today, you know, some days I feel like I just want to pinch myself. And I think, you know, I just can't believe that, that this is where I am. I came to a city that I hated, and I've learned to love it. There's a lot you can do in Christchurch. And so, you know, I'm here tonight to share my story and hope that, you know, somebody will get some sense out of it. Seems a bit jumbled, but, you know, this is it. And I am so very grateful for the people that have kept coming before me, and for the meetings that I come to, because it's like second nature. And, you know, that's it. That's me for tonight. So thank you.